first light of dawn was a pale stripe on the horizon, bleeding color into the black sky. Elara stepped out of her small adobe cabin into the cool morning air, pulling her shawl tight around her shoulders. The high desert was her home, a vast and silent world of red rock and dry scrub. She moved quietly, her eyes scanning the ground for the tracks of rabbits or foxes as she went to check her trap lines. It was a lonely life, but it was the one she had chosen, and she knew every shadow and every sound of this place. This morning, however, was different. A deep and unnatural quiet had settled over the land. The usual scuttling of lizards in the brush was absent. The wind itself seemed to be holding its breath. An uneasy feeling prickled at the back of her neck. It was the kind of silence that meant something was wrong. Her steps slowed as her eyes swept the wide, empty expanse around her, searching for the source of the stillness. Then she saw it. A dark shape lying crumpled near a patch of thorny greasewood. At first she thought it was a deer that had fallen to a mountain lion, but as she drew closer, the shape resolved into something else entirely. It was a man. He was lying face down in the sand, one arm twisted awkwardly beneath him. The dusty blue fabric of his jacket was familiar, a cavalry uniform, and rising from the center of his back was the terrible reason for the silence. It was the shaft of an arrow, its red and black feathers a violent splash of color in the soft dawn light. Her breath caught in her throat. A wounded man was trouble. A wounded lawman was a disaster. Whoever had done this could still be nearby. Every instinct told her to turn around, to go back to her cabin and lock the door. But then she saw the slight shuddering movement of his ribs. He was still alive. He was alone and left for dead under the vast, uncaring sky. She could not just leave him. Crouching down, she placed a hand on his shoulder. He did not stir. With a great effort, she managed to roll him onto his side. His face was pale and etched with pain, even in unconsciousness. Knowing she had no other choice, Elara began the difficult task of getting him to shelter. She looped his arms over her shoulders and half-dragged, half-carried his dead weight across the sand. The journey back to her cabin was slow and exhausting. By the time she reached her door, her muscles burned and both of them were covered in a film of dust and sweat. She managed to get him onto her narrow cot where he lay still, his breathing a shallow rasp. The arrow stood like a grim flag, marking him for death. She knew the real danger had only just begun. The heavy wooden door of the cabin shut out the growing dawn, sealing them in a dim, quiet world. Elara's hands, usually so steady when skinning a rabbit or grinding herbs, now trembled as she looked at the man on her cot. The arrow was a monstrous thing, a violation of the peaceful order of her home. She knew she could not pull it out. The arrowhead was buried deep, and doing so would likely cause him to bleed to death on her floor, but she could not leave it as it was. Working quickly, she built up the fire in her small hearth, bringing a pot of water to boil. She gathered her medicines, a small pouch of yarrow leaves, a jar of strong honey, and clean strips of cloth. Taking a deep breath to steady her nerves, she grasped the long wooden shaft of the arrow. The man groaned, a low animal sound of pain, but did not wake. With a sharp, decisive motion, she snapped the shaft a hand's width from his back. She let out a breath she did not realize she was holding. The worst part was over. She carefully cut away the bloody fabric of his jacket and shirt, revealing the angry wound. She cleaned it as best she could with the hot water, patting the skin gently. She packed the pierced flesh with the yarrow to fight infection and smeared the sticky honey over it, a trick her mother had taught her to help seal and heal. Finally, she wrapped the cloth bandages around his chest and shoulder, tying them securely. His breathing seemed to ease just a little, the lines of pain on his face softening as the clean dressing brought some small comfort. As she was folding his ruined jacket to use as a pillow, her fingers brushed against something stiff and papery in an inside pocket. Curiosity overcoming caution, she pulled it out. It was a folded piece of paper, its edge stained a rusty brown with his blood. She unfolded it carefully, smoothing it on her knee near the firelight. The words seemed to leap from the page. Wanted, it shouted in big black letters, for stage robbery, murder, arson. The reward was an unimaginable $5,000, but it was the faces that made her blood run cold. 3 men, brothers according to the text, with the last name Cordera. They had dark, cruel eyes and scowling faces that promised violence. This was the kind of evil that passed through a place and left it scarred. Her eyes dropped to the bottom of the poster. There, written in a quick, slashing pencil, was a message that explained everything. Track to Red Canyon. J. Marsh. The marshal's name was Jonah. He had not been shot by random bandits. He had been hunted and ambushed by these monsters. The arrow in his back was not just a weapon. It was a message. And the men who had sent it would not simply forget the lawman who had tracked down their secret. They would come to finish the job. Elara looked from the dangerous faces on the poster to the pale, wounded man on her cot. She had not just brought an injured man into her home. She had brought the storm itself. The sun climbed higher, its light now a harsh, flat glare that erased the gentle colors of dawn and baked the hard, packed earth of Elara's yard. Inside the cabin, the air was thick and still, heavy with the smell of herbs and the marshal's feverish sweat. Elara sat perfectly straight on a stool by the single window, her father's long rifle balanced across her knees. Her eyes were fixed on the empty expanse of desert, scanning the shimmering heat waves for any sign of movement. Every few minutes she would glance over at the man on the cot. His sleep was fitful, his head turning side to side as he muttered words she could not quite understand. Trapped in a nightmare of his own making, the wanted poster lay on the table beside her, the faces of the Cordera brothers a silent accusation. She knew they were out there. Men like that did not just ride away. They would circle back like vultures, patient and cruel, waiting for the right moment to descend. The first sign was a distant plume of dust, a faint brown smudge against the brilliant blue sky. Elara's grip tightened on the rifle stock. Her heart began a slow, heavy drumbeat against her ribs. She watched as the smudge resolved into 3 distinct figures on horseback, moving with a lazy arrogance that suggested they owned every inch of land they crossed. They did not hurry. They knew what they would find. Her mouth went dry. She carefully set the rifle down against the wall, just out of sight, and smoothed her skirt, trying to compose her face into something neutral, something that did not scream of the fear chilling her blood. She opened the door just as the riders reined their horses to a stop in the center of her yard. The leader was a man with a face like worn leather, etched with deep lines that spoke of a hard life and harder choices. His eyes were the color of flint, and they swept over her and her cabin with a cold, assessing gaze. The other 2 hung back slightly. One was younger, his fingers nervously tapping on his saddle horn, while the other was a hulking brute of a man with a thick beard and empty eyes. The leader tipped his hat, a gesture that was meant to be polite but felt like a threat. "Mornin', ma'am," he said. His voice was calm, almost friendly, but it did not match the flatness in his eyes. "We're looking for a friend of ours. Got himself hurt in a little disagreement last night. We're powerful worried about him. Might have come through here." Elara forced herself to meet his gaze to keep her own voice level and light. "I've seen no one," she said. The lie felt brittle on her tongue. "You're the first folks I've seen in a week." The man's thin smile did not reach his eyes. He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting past her as if he could see right through the wooden walls of her cabin. Then he nodded slowly, almost to himself, and pointed with his chin toward the ground near her water trough. "That's a powerful lot of blood for butchering a chicken," he observed, his false friendliness beginning to evaporate. Elara's heart plummeted. She followed his gaze to a dark, unmistakable stain on the pale earth near the trough. She had been so careful inside, but she had missed a spot outside. She had been in too much of a panic, dragging the marshal's heavy weight. It was a mistake, and it was all the proof he needed. Before she could form a reply, the younger man with the nervous hand spoke up, his voice cracking with excitement. "Boss, look there." He was pointing to her small corral where a single dusty bay horse stood swishing its tail. "That's his horse, the marshal's bay. I'd know that white sock on the foreleg anywhere." The leader's face transformed. All pretense of civility vanished, stripped away to reveal the ruthless man beneath. The flat, cold eyes locked onto Elara. "We'll be taking him now, ma'am," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "And the reward money he's carrying saves us the trouble of digging it up later." "He tell you where he hid it?" The big man dismounted, his boots hitting the ground with a heavy thud. He took a step toward her door, his sheer size blocking out the sun. The threat was as physical as a punch. The time for lies was over. Elara did not hesitate. In one smooth, practiced motion, she brought the rifle up from where it leaned against the wall. The wooden stock settled firmly against her shoulder, and she sighted down the long barrel, the end of it aimed directly at the leader's chest. Her hands were steady now, all fear burned away by a cold, clear certainty. The only thing you'll be taking from my land is a hole, she said. Her voice was low, but it carried across the yard, sharp and absolute. Now turn your horses around and ride out. The leader's eyes widened in genuine surprise, then narrowed in fury. He laughed, a dry, humorless sound. Little woman like you? With one shot? There's 3 of us. I know, Elara replied, her finger resting lightly on the trigger. Her gaze never wavered from his. But I only need 1 shot to kill you. Your boys will have to decide if $5,000 is worth carrying your corpse all the way back to town. A profound silence fell over the yard. The only sound was the sigh of the wind and the restless stamp of a horse. The leader stared at her, and for the first time he seemed to truly see her. He saw the resolve in her eyes, the unshakable steadiness of her aim. He saw a woman who was not bluffing, a woman who had nothing left to lose and a home to defend. He calculated the odds, his eyes flicking from her to his men and back again. He saw the truth. She would not miss. Slowly, very slowly, he held up a hand, stopping the big man in his tracks. His jaw was clenched tight with fury. The moment stretched, thin and taut as a wire. Finally, he gave a curt, furious nod. This ain't over, he spat, the words dripping with venom. It is for today, Elara replied, the rifle still held rock steady. She watched, unmoving, as the big man remounted. She watched as the 3 of them turned their horses, the leader casting one last hateful glance over his shoulder. She watched until they were nothing more than specks on the vast horizon, swallowed by the rippling heat. Only then did she allow herself to lower the rifle. Her arms ached with the tension, and she leaned against the doorframe, her breath coming in a sudden rush. She had won this moment, but she knew his words were true. It was not over. The dust settled slowly in the wake of the retreating horses, each particle drifting back to earth in the silent, heavy air. Elara remained in the doorway, her knuckles white where they still gripped the rifle. The echo of the leader's threat seemed to hang in the yard, a poisonous cloud that the wind refused to disperse. This ain't over. She knew he was right. Men like that did not admit defeat. They licked their wounds and they planned their return. She had not scared them off for good. She had only bought a little time and perhaps made them angrier, more determined. She forced her stiff legs to move, stepping back inside and closing the door. The familiar interior of her cabin, usually a place of peace and safety, now felt like a fragile box surrounded by a vast, hostile world. The room was dim, the only light coming from the single window and the low fire. Her eyes adjusted, and she found herself looking directly into the clear gray eyes of the Marshal. He was awake. He had been propped up on one elbow, his face pale and beaded with sweat from the effort, but his gaze was sharp and utterly focused on her. He had seen everything. He had heard everything. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the ragged pull of his breath. He was the first to break the silence. His voice was a dry rasp, each word an obvious effort. I am sorry. The apology was simple, and it carried the weight of true regret. I never meant to bring this down on you. Elara leaned the rifle back against the wall by the door, a deliberate and careful movement. She walked to the table and poured a cup of water from the pitcher. Her hands were steady now, her purpose clear. She brought the cup to him, holding it to his lips so he could drink. Drink, she said, her own voice quieter than usual. You did not shoot yourself in the back. He drank greedily, water spilling down his chin. When he was done, he sank back onto the cot, exhausted by the small action, but his eyes remained on her, filled with a new, weary respect. That was a brave thing, he whispered. A foolish thing, maybe, but brave. He paused, gathering his strength. His name is Silas Cordera, the one who spoke. The other 2 are his brothers, Levi and Jude. Levi's the jumpy one. Jude's the big one. They are not men who give up. Elara sat on the stool beside his cot, the weight of the day pressing down on her. I know, she said, looking toward the door as if she could still see them. He said they want you for reward money you are carrying. A bitter, pained sound that was almost a laugh escaped him. I am not carrying it. That is the cruel joke of it. They robbed a stage, a big one. They had a strong box full of railroad payroll. They buried it somewhere out there before I caught up to them. He gestured weakly toward the desert beyond the walls. They think I saw where. They think if they can get their hands on me, they can make me tell them. But I never saw a thing. I just found their trail too late. The pieces clicked into place for Elara, forming a picture more terrifying than simple greed. This was not just about a reward. It was about a fortune buried in the desert, and these men believed the key to finding it was lying wounded in her cabin. They would not stop. They would bring more men, or they would wait until nightfall, or they would burn the cabin down around them to get to him. She looked at the marshal, really looked at him. He was not just a lawman. He was a man who knew secrets that could get them both killed. And she was not just a woman living alone anymore. She was his only protector. Their fates were now tied together, a knot pulled tight by greed and violence. They were trapped, and the walls of her simple adobe home felt thinner than paper. The standoff in the yard was not the end. It was only the beginning of the storm. The truth of their situation settled over the small cabin like a heavy blanket. The marshal, Jonah, watched Elara's face, waiting for the fear, the anger, the regret he surely expected. Instead, he saw her features harden into an expression of grim resolve. She was not a woman who crumbled under pressure. She was a woman who assessed a problem and began to look for solutions. She stood up and walked back to the door, not to look out but to slide the thick wooden bar across it, locking them in. The solid thud of the bar falling into place was a declaration. They were in this together now. She returned to his side, her practical nature taking over. "We need to get your strength back," she stated, as if discussing a chore that needed doing. "And we need a plan. They will be back, and next time they will not ask politely." She helped him sit up a little more, propping him up with her spare blanket and his own rolled-up jacket. She brought him a simple broth she had simmering by the fire, and watched as he managed to sip it, his hands trembling slightly. Each spoonful was a small victory. As the afternoon light began to soften, painting long shadows across the dirt floor, they talked. It was not the easy talk of friends, but the necessary talk of allies planning for a siege. Jonah told her more about the Cordera brothers, their methods, their short tempers, and their tendency for brute force over cleverness. Elara listened intently, her mind storing every detail. In return, she told him about the land. She described the arroyo that ran behind the cabin, a dry riverbed that could provide cover. She pointed out the best sightlines from the windows, where the desert was flat and open for nearly a mile, leaving no place for men to hide as they approached. A quiet understanding grew between them, built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared danger. He was a man of the law, used to giving orders and chasing down leads across vast territories. She was a woman of the earth, used to relying on her own two hands and her deep knowledge of a single, specific place. Their skills were different, but they fit together. He had the experience of violence. She had the advantage of home. "We cannot just wait for them to come to us," Jonah said, his voice growing stronger with the nourishment and rest. "We need to even the odds." Elara nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "My rifle is good for distance," she said, "but it is slow to reload. If they get close." Jonah gestured weakly toward his gun belt, which hung over the back of her chair. "My Colt," he said. "It is made for close work. You need to know how to use it." The idea was startling. She had never fired a revolver before. The rifle was for hunting, for putting food on the table. The pistol was a weapon meant for fighting men, but she saw the sense in it. When she brought him the heavy leather belt, he instructed her, his voice a steady, patient rasp. He showed her how to check the cylinder was loaded, how to hold the weight of it in both hands, how to sight down the short barrel. He could not demonstrate himself, too weak to even lift it, but his words were clear and precise. Elara practiced the motions, unloaded, pointing the weapon at the far wall. The metal was cold and foreign in her hands, a tool of a world she had always avoided, but as she listened to his instructions, a new feeling began to push aside the fear. It was a spark of defiance, a hardening of her will. She was not just a victim waiting in her home. She was becoming a defender, preparing her fortress. She looked from the determined set of Jonah's jaw to the revolver in her hands. They were no longer just a wounded man and a solitary woman. They were a partnership, and they were getting ready for a fight. The following day was a long, tense exercise in preparation. A strange new rhythm settled over the cabin, one of quiet industry and shared purpose. Elara moved with a focused energy, her earlier fear now channeled into action. Jonah, propped up on the cot, became her advisor, his eyes constantly scanning the room and the view from the window, looking for weaknesses, planning for angles of attack. His body was still broken, but his mind was sharp and clear, a lawman's mind trained for survival. Their first task was to turn the humble adobe hut into a fortress. Elara dragged her small heavy table and shoved it against the door, adding its solid weight to the wooden bar. It was not much, but it would slow anyone down who tried to force their way inside. Then, using an old hammer and a few precious nails, she began to board up the smaller back window completely, sealing off one potential point of entry. For the main window by the door, she did something different. She left it open, but only a crack. She moved a sack of grain in front of it, creating a rest for her rifle barrel and a narrow slit to see and shoot through. It was Jonah's idea. "They will come from the front," he had said, his voice low. "They will want to talk first, to threaten. That window is your best advantage. Do not give it up." In the lulls between these physical tasks, the lessons continued. When Elara's arms grew tired from hammering, she would sit by the cot and take the Marshal's heavy revolver in her hands. He drilled her on its mechanics until she could open the cylinder, check the loads, and snap it shut again without having to look. He made her practice aiming, holding the weight of the gun steady until her muscles trembled. "Aim for the center of mass," he instructed, his voice a steady, calm guide in the quiet room. "Do not try to be fancy. Just aim for the biggest part of them, and breathe out when you pull the trigger." She learned about the men they faced not just as names on a poster, but as individuals with flaws. "Silas is the brains," Jonah explained, his gaze distant. "He is cruel, but he is also careful. He will not charge in blindly. He will try to find a way to trick you, to get you to open that door. Levy is the weak one. He is nervous and he is greedy. If this goes badly for them, he might be the first to break and run." "Jude," he said, and a shadow passed over his face. "Jude just likes to hurt things. He will do whatever Silas tells him. Do not waste a shot on Jude unless he is coming right at you. Stop the leader and you stop the pack." As the second sunset approached, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, a quiet calm settled over them. The cabin was as ready as it could be. The door was barricaded, the windows fortified. The rifle leaned against the wall by the front window slit. The revolver lay on the table, loaded and ready. A pot of coffee simmered on the hearth, a small normalcy in the face of the coming storm. They had done all they could. They had used the time Jonah's fever had bought them, and the time Elara's bravery had won them. They had turned her home into a trap, and themselves into its guardians. They did not speak much. There was nothing left to say. They simply waited, listening to the desert nightfall, knowing that the peace was temporary, and that the Cordera brothers were out there in the growing dark, making plans of their own. The waiting ended just as the sun began to bleed its first light over the mesa. There was no polite approach this time, no false greetings. The thunder of hooves was their announcement. 4 riders now, not 3. Silas had found another gun. They did not stop at the edge of the yard. They rode right up to the cabin, their horses kicking up clouds of dust, and immediately began to circle the structure like wolves, looking for a weakness. Jude the brute dismounted and immediately started testing the boarded-up back window, shaking the planks with his huge hands. "Come on out, Marshal." Silas's voice rang out, sharp and mocking. "We know you are in there. Send out the woman and we might let her live." He stayed on his horse, a safe distance back, letting the others do the dirty work. Inside, Elara stood at the front firing slit, her cheek pressed against the cool wood of the rifle stock. Jonah was propped up on the floor behind the grain sack, his back against the wall, the loaded revolver in his lap. His job was to watch the door. Her job was everything else. "Ignore him," Jonah whispered, his voice a low, steady thread in the tense air. "Wait for a clear shot." The new man, eager to prove himself, rode his horse too close to the front window. Elara did not hesitate. The roar of the rifle was enormous in the small space. The man cried out, clutching his arm, and his horse reared in panic, throwing him from the saddle. He lay in the dirt, moaning. One down. The shot broke the tension completely. Levi, the nervous brother, began firing wildly at the cabin, his bullets thudding harmlessly into the thick adobe walls. Jude abandoned the back window and ran around to the front, a monstrous shadow in the dim light heading straight for the door. He raised a leg to kick it in. "Elara, the door!" Jonah barked. She turned, but she was too slow with the long rifle. As Jude's boot connected with the solid wood, Jonah, with a grunt of immense pain, raised the revolver with his good arm. He fired twice. The bullet slammed into the door right where Jude's body would be on the other side. There was a roar of anger and pain, and the kicking stopped. They heard a heavy body stumble backward. Silas, seeing his brothers falling, screamed in fury. He drew his own pistol and kicked his horse forward, charging the front of the cabin in a blind rage. He was done with tricks. He was coming to finish it himself. Elara turned back to the firing slit. She saw him coming, his face a mask of hate, his gun aimed at the window. She took a breath, let it out slowly, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle shot echoed across the desert. Silas Cordera jerked backward, a look of profound surprise on his face, and slid from his saddle, landing motionless in the dirt. The sudden silence was deafening. The only sounds were the whimpering of the wounded new man and the ragged breathing of Jude, who was crawling away into the scrub. Levy stared at his brother's body on the ground. He looked at the cabin, a silent, deadly fortress that had taken down 3 of them. The greed in his eyes was finally replaced by raw animal fear. He turned his horse and fled, whipping it into a gallop, not looking back. Elara stood frozen at the window, the smell of gunpowder thick in her nose. It was over. Slowly, she lowered the rifle. Her hands began to shake. Jonah let his head fall back against the wall, his eyes closed, his face pale with exhaustion and pain. Hours later, a cloud of dust appeared, this one larger and more official. A sheriff and his posse, alerted by a homesteader who had heard the distant gunfire, arrived. They found Silas dead, his hired gun wounded, and Jude long gone, leaving a trail of blood. They took statements from Elara and the barely conscious Marshal. In the days that followed, Jonah healed properly under Elara's care. The color returned to his face and the strength to his body. The time came for him to leave. He stood by his horse, now saddled and ready. He looked at Elara, the woman who had pulled him from the desert, stood down killers, and saved his life. "I will not forget this," he said, his voice strong now, filled with a gratitude too big for words. "You have the heart of a Marshal." Elara smiled, a true and tired smile. "I am just a woman who likes her quiet," she said. But they both knew that was not entirely true anymore. She watched him ride away until he was a speck on the horizon, just as she had watched his enemies disappear. The desert was quiet again, but the silence felt different now. It was not a lonely silence. It was a peaceful one. She had defended her home. She had faced the storm and she had won. She turned and walked back into her cabin, ready to enjoy the quiet she had fought so hard to keep. The end.